Welcome everyone to today's webinar where we'll be talking about the differences and relationships between these two strategies that you can see on my board, spaced learning versus massed practice. Now, spaced learning, by the way, is also commonly known as disturbed practice. And what spaced learning basically means is that you're practicing a particular skill or something along those lines over a period of time. So the example that I like to use is surfing, because in each of these different videos, I usually try and pick a different example instead of sticking to the same example over and over again. Now, so let's use surfing. And now let's assume that you're going surfing one day, say per week, so on a Saturday, for 1 hour. So for 1 hour there. So it's one day per week on a Saturday for 1 hour. Now, in 52 weeks, you will have been surfing 52 times, let's say, in our example. Now, with spaced learning, the whole premise of this particular strategy or this particular way of learning something is that you're practicing and improving over a long period of time. Now, in this particular example, we've done it over 1 year. Of course, in a school-based environment, you might be practicing each day for a little bit each day. You might be practicing once a fortnight. You might be practicing 3 or 4 times a week because you've got a lesson on 3 or 4 times a week for that particular skill or that particular topic. But the point of spaced learning, or disturbed practice as it's sometimes known, is that there is a gap between each practice session or each attempt at becoming better. And the most important part, I guess, is that that gap is usually at least, say, 1 to 2 nights worth of sleep. Because when we go to sleep, that's when our brains work really, really hard to develop those connections and those synapses that make recall a lot easier, and that it helps develop that muscle memory and so on and so forth. So that gap in time, particularly a gap that involves sleep, is really important. And I have read some research that shows that the closer to the point where you practice something before you go to sleep, the more your skills can develop over a shorter period of time. So some experts advise that if you want to get better at something, say playing a piano, then if you practice that at 7, 8 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock at night, for say 10, 15 minutes, and then you sleep on it, and then the next day you practice again, that's one of the more effective ways of going about doing that, as opposed to say practicing at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning, where possible anyway. So that's the idea of spaced learning. It's got a lot to do with how our brain acquires new information and what physically happens in the brain when we're actually learning. So it's a really interesting topic to look into. But the main crux of it is that when you do learn something, say on day 1, your brain needs time to process it in most cases, to really consolidate it and to get better at it, particularly at things like surfing or any of those gross motor or fine motor skills. And you'll find that if you've tried doing something before, you could practice surfing for 10 hours in one day. Are you going to be better in the 10th hour or 7th hour than you were on, say, the 2nd or the 3rd hour? Maybe, maybe not. But then you go and sleep on it and come back the next day or a couple of days later, and suddenly you're a lot better at that particular thing, and it all makes sense, and your body can do what you want it to do a lot more effectively and efficiently. So you've developed that muscle memory. And that happens at night, mainly at night when you go to sleep, and your synapses and neurons and all the other bits and pieces, those pathways are being connected and strengthened and made more efficient and so on and so forth. So that's the basic idea of spaced learning and how it really works from that physical perspective. Now, the difference between spaced learning and mass practice, and why I like to teach these together, is because they're like two polar opposites. And of course, you can use them together like a lot of different strategies, but they are two polar opposites. But just quickly, spaced learning has a lot in common, or is quite often used in conjunction with some other teaching strategies that I've been talking about recently. And that is, I don't want to write that up there. I'll write that down here. That is whole part whole learning, whole part whole learning, and the one that goes with whole part whole learning. So please, I would recommend watching the video on whole part learning either now or straight after watching this, because there are 4 strategies that really go together that are, I guess, important and closely related, particularly when you're developing skills and purposefully or deliberately trying to develop skills. And that's what the second one is, which is deliberate practice, also known as purposeful practice. So I won't talk about them anymore because I don't want this video to go on for hours. But basically, these 4 strategies are quite often used in combination with each other. And a lot of coaches and trainers use these strategies anyway. They just aren't aware that there's actually a name for what they're doing. There's a few other ones that might be of interest that are, I guess, lesser known strategies, such as elaboration. So that means that there's an iterative approach to learning. It gets slightly harder as things goes on, or slightly more complicated, or you're adding new bits of information as you go through the process to, again, do a particular skill or product or task to a higher level. So look up elaboration. Not really that overly important in this whole scheme of things, but they are useful strategies to have at your disposal, even if you're not actually using them. But definitely, if you're doing sport, any type of those activities and teaching students in that regard, anything that involves physical improvement, including those more fine motor type skills like the art or knitting or whatever, then certainly have a look into whole part whole learning and deliberate practice. But I think there's a lot to learn about spaced practice and mass practice, even for the more academic tasks like writing or doing maths problems or things along those tasks of that sort of nature. Because if you spend 2 hours with a student practicing one particular thing, yes, they're going to get better over time, but they're going to get better in that particular practice session, which is more along the lines of mass practice. But there are easier ways to improve and less frustrating ways to improve that are more effective in a shorter total period of time. And that's, for example, by doing 15 minutes today, 15 minutes tomorrow, 15 minutes the day after. So that's where spaced learning and massed practice can either be combined in a way, and I'll go through how to do that in a minute, or you can make the decision to use one or the other and to adjust the way in which you're teaching students based on what you know about spaced learning, based on the fact that we know that we need to do a certain amount of practice on a particular topic in one day, but there is a limit, and you get to that point where doing extra practice, there's less of a return on that time, and you're much better off going away, letting the brain develop and consolidate and physically actually grow, so that then you can come back at a future period in a couple of days or whatever, to then try and to then improve again and to follow that process over and over again. Now, I like to make the comparison between spaced learning and mass practice for this reason, because I think it just makes logical sense, right? So if you're surfing 1 hour a day for 52 weeks, you're going to gradually get better at surfing, particularly if you're using deliberate practice. Now, compare that to surfing 52 hours in 2 weeks. So you're just doing this massive massed practice sort of session where you're just going crazy. And in 2 weeks, you're surfing 52 times. So what's that? 26 times per week. So you're going 3 or 4 times a day, 4 times a day? Almost 4 times a day you're going, 4 hours a day you're going surfing as opposed to 1 hour a day. Now these are sort of extreme examples and you can sort of argue backwards and forth, but if you were to think about who's going to be the best possible, who is going to be better, the person A who surfs 1 hour per week over a period of time, or person B who goes for a 2-week surf. And I would almost guarantee that it's going to be, assuming these are comparable people, it's almost always going to be this person here who's going to be significantly better at surfing. Now, 1 day a week actually is probably enough time where your brain will be able to develop and so on and so forth, but an ideal situation, I would think, and this is more of a gut instinct, I don't think it's necessarily research-based or anything, I would think that 2 or 3 times per week is more appropriate because you're going to practice, learn how to surf or practice a certain thing, gives your brain a couple of days to mull that over and improve and grow and whatnot, and then say you went surfing on the Sunday, then maybe it's the Wednesday, then maybe it's the Saturday. So there's a time delay, but there's not a massive time delay. And so I think a week might be pushing it a little bit. So they might be getting to the point where you're starting to lose that effect. Because with spaced learning, there is a limit. So if you do, if your brain is developing and putting all that information into its long-term memory, but if there is a gap of say 2 months or 3 months or something like that, then obviously that information starts to fall out of your brain and those synapses start being used for other things or being moved around or whatever. So those physical changes in your brain can also be by and large undone if there's too big of a gap in between. So that's the main difference between spaced learning and massed practice. So massed practice basically means there's no gap. Right, an example of that is 100 times golf. Now let's not do 100, let's do 400. 400 times golf shots. So you're going to a practice range, you want to deliberately practice something very specific, and you're just practicing hitting a golf ball 400 times. Just a massive number of practices, and you're thinking about and trying to get better at something. So that's an example of massed practice. Now, sometimes we have to do mass practice, and that's not to say it's bad. Normally when you read about mass practice, it's spoken about in terms of it being not the most effective strategy. It's not necessarily true. I think we need to think also about where it can be used and where it can be effective. So if you've only got a small amount of time and you can spend 3 hours hitting golf balls, then there's nothing wrong with that, and you're still going to improve from start to finish, particularly, again, as I say, if you are using deliberate practice and if you're getting lots of feedback and you're stopping and thinking about how you're going and so on. But a more effective way, instead of doing 400 golf shots in 1 day, might be to do 100 golf shots times 4 days. So in that sense, you're doing 100 shots today and waiting a couple of days or a week or say 3 days, let's say 3 days, waiting 3 days and then doing another 100 shots. Your brain has the time to then physically change and develop those connections and so on and so forth. So that's the difference between spaced learning and mass practice. Now there are several different reasons for this. So there are several different reasons for why spaced learning is really effective. Obviously, there are the physical reasons that I've discussed just a minute ago that that is well known, and we've known about that from a scientific point of view for decades and decades. But there's one aspect, or one, I guess, a theory of why spaced learning is so effective, and it's called encoding variability theory. Now, encoding variability theory basically says that there are a variety, so variability, there's a variety of contexts in which you are practicing that particular task. So in this case with surfing, there might be, I don't want to rub that off. We'll go down here. Okay, so in this case with surfing, there is winter, there is big waves, there is different beaches, different locations, and there's wind, different wind conditions, etc., etc., etc. There's also just opportunities to observe. Yeah, that sounds good. So there's various different opportunities to observe other people. So if you go to the beach on Saturday and you're spending an hour there, while you're there, there'll also be probably 20 other people there. And then the week after, it won't be that same 20 people. It'll be a different type of, a different group, I guess you could say, and who have different skills and different experiences. And also there'll be different, so it might be winter, it might be, say, spring. So you've got different seasons as well. So, and all the different combinations there, not only different people to observe and for you to acquire information and knowledge from, because you might be just watching them, you might be speaking to them and so on, but also you're going through that process in different seasons as well. There could be big waves, there could be little waves, there could be medium-sized waves. Obviously that's affected by the wind and temperature and all that kind of stuff, and where the sandbars are moving and things. And also you're more likely to go to lots of different locations if each week you're going surfing somewhere different, as opposed to this one where you've got 2 weeks. You're only probably going to go to 2 or 3 different beaches or something in a certain area. Whereas over here, you're probably going surfing when you're on holiday or when you're in a different country, or you might be doing bigger trips with friends or something like that. So the whole range of different reasons for why over a 1 year period, you're going to have a much more variable array of experiences than if you're cramming your learning into a 2 week period. Now, as I was saying before, that's not to say that cramming in a 2 week period, there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but it's important just to be aware of the fact that learning in a spaced learning way means that you will have more opportunities to learn in a variety of different contexts and from a variety of different people. So if you are to learn in this sense, then it's going to be limiting in that sense, or limiting in that way. And that's why my general advice is that using a combination of spaced learning and mass practice is also an option as well. And that could mean, for example, doing this 52 hours in 2 weeks, followed by doing some spaced learning where you are then going surfing every week or twice a week or whatever over a long period of time. And I think that's a very effective way to do something where you're front loading. That's called front loading. In the adult sort of education sector, we call that front loading. So you're front loading a course with mass practice, some mass practice there, and then you're doing that consistent spaced learning method to really consolidate and build on the foundations that you've learnt by doing some type of mass practice at the start. Because you might have, in this instance, this might be a case of going and doing a course and studying or learning that particular skill to get to a certain level of proficiency, so that then you can just casually do it on the weekend every now and then and still aim to build your skills, but not necessarily do it in a full-time 26 hours per week type of way. So anyway, that's how they can be combined. That's the whole purpose of encoding variability theory, or not the whole purpose, but that's one of the reasons for why spaced learning is much more effective. Now, study phase retrieval theory, again, is another theory that is used to try and explain why spaced learning is much more effective than mass practice. Now, there are actually lots of different theories. I usually only use 3 because I think these are the 3 probably most important ones. We've already gone through just physical changes. So I'm sure there's a technical term for that I'm just not aware of, but physical changes. So that's synapses. And all of these are really talking about the different physical changes that are occurring in the brain to help people develop. And also, there's actually, not just in the brain, but there's physical changes that occur in your body as well. Particularly if, say, you're learning surfing or golf or whatever, you might develop extra flexibility or extra strength and so forth. And you're much more likely to develop that strength over a period of a year if you're doing something, I don't know, martial arts or whatever, a couple of times a week as opposed to doing it for 2 weeks straight. And the other thing to bear in mind is that, you know, it's not only the difference between who's going to be better at the end of that 12-month period, but if you think, okay, in 3 years' time, who's going to actually have the most amount of memory or the most amount of recall? Is it someone that does this over 1 year and does it 52 times? Or is it someone and gradually acquires those skills or knowledge? Or is it going to be someone who front loads and just does it in one big massed learning type scenario? And again, I think if you fast forwarded, let's say this person did not go surfing ever again after 52 times, and then this person did 2 weeks and never went surfing again, and then we went and did a competition to see who was better at surfing in 3 years' time, you can guarantee that this person is probably not going to be anywhere near as good as this person here. And part of it is because of that variability theory, and part of it is because of what is known as study phase retrieval theory. Now, basically, study phase basically means they're talking about the period that you're going through and studying, and whether that's short, long, whether there's gaps or whatnot. Retrieval is, again, talking about these synapses and the connections in the brain and the ability for the brain, one step back. Every time you go through and you're learning something here, you're putting that information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. And then when you come back a week later, you have to take that information out of your long-term memory and you have to bring it forward again to your short-term or your working memory. So then you have to actually action and use that information there. Whereas under mass practice, because it all happens in such a short period of time, you're not necessarily pushing it into your long-term memory and then retrieving it into your short-term memory. So hopefully I've explained that in a way that makes sense, because that one's probably a little bit more complicated, I guess, than encoding. But effectively, if you think of, let's actually draw it. So if you were to do spaced learning, let's say let's go S for short-term memory and L for long-term memory. Under spaced learning, every single week, we're doing this. Whereas with mass practice, it only really ever stays there. A little bit will come there, but not a huge amount. Now, obviously, if you think of the middle bit here, if you think of that little middle bit there as your synapses, right? Could have just linked it to that bit there. If you think of that middle bit there as your synapses, every time you go from this part of your brain, the short-term memory, to that part of your brain, which is the long-term part of your memory, or your long-term memory, and there's another part over here called your working memory. Now, every time you do that, this synapse here is going to get stronger. So it's going to get stronger and thicker like that. Literally, physically, it will get stronger and thicker. And not only that, it's going to have more. So you're going to have more of them and more strong ones as well. And they learn how to talk to each other like this. So they can talk to each other. So they find shortcuts. So it gets stronger, just like any other muscle. And then the more you do it, the stronger it gets. Okay? Like that. So you can see how much bandwidth there is there between the short-term memory and the long-term memory. That means you can recall it really quick. And that means that the information stored there can be moved backwards and forwards really, really quick. Now, there's another term that I like to use. I guess I do like to use it. Another, I guess it's it's more of a psychology term, I guess, than anything, but it is used in education a lot, called schema. And a person's schema is the way in which they've organised information and content in their head. That, I think, is the best way to explain it. So over here, in long-term memory, is where your sort of equals schema. And you'll have information in here organised in various different ways. Now, for people who are new at learning things, it might be a bit mumbled, jumbled, and that bit might not really relate to that bit very well, but you'll have these connections, right? So that piece of information, you'll understand that it's connected to that bit, that piece of information is connected to that, and so forth. Now, for people who are really experienced and who have spent a lot of time learning something, their schema is much more well developed. So they can see how all these things connected. That bit of information connects to that bit connects to that, and so on and so forth. Now, as you get more experienced and you develop these networks, any little bit of information that comes into short-term memory there, let's say the different winds or the different sides of the waves or how they sort of combine together to have a certain effect or whatever, can easily pass there because you've got heaps of bandwidth, right? And can easily get added to there. And that's quite clearly related to that little bit of information. But because there's such a strong connection in that existing schema or that existing understanding of how all the different aspects join together, it's not very hard to add another piece of information. Whereas if you don't have a very well-developed, what am I doing here? Short-term, long-term. If you don't have a very well-developed connection between short-term and long-term, and it's just like that, there's limited bandwidth there, and new information that comes in there is going to struggle. And let's say there's only 6 pieces of information there, because under a mass practice, there's not a huge amount that gets put into long-term memory, because even after surfing for 26 times, it's kind of mostly still sitting in short-term memory. Whereas over here, because you've practiced going backwards and forth so many times, these things have developed just like if you were going to the gym and lifting weights. These synapses have developed and they're so strong that and so thick that they're able to more effectively and efficiently move new information into that existing schema and to be able to push it out at the same time. So you're learning, but also doing and practicing at the same time. Okay, so there's one other bit called, let's do brown. Consolidation theory. So the third one that I'll talk about, and that we've basically already covered, is the idea of exactly the same as what we were saying there. So the idea of consolidation and the process of constantly reviewing and thinking about and going backwards and forth between short-term memory and long-term memory. So, I guess this is where the massed practice is also connected to space learning in a sense, because you are mass practicing it here, but just over a period of time. And the effect of doing things over a period of time, once those synapses and neurons and things start growing and start getting really strong, slowly, well, not decrease, but the effect of the gap in time between studying or between learning becomes less and less. So that's where consolidation theory really comes from, this idea that over time you're not just retrieving information, but you're also putting information in there on a more regular basis, and as you put it in there, it gets stuck in that schema. So I wouldn't be too worried about particularly these all of them. I wouldn't be too worried about all of them and memorizing them or anything. The variability one is the easiest to understand. The idea of constantly retrieving it backwards and forth is quite easy to understand. Consolidation is probably a little bit more tricky, but certainly I've got a big section about that on my blog, so have a read through the consolidation aspect. But that's basically just, again, the volume of time that you can go backwards and forth between the two, just like you would in any lesson, to consolidate that information and those new skills and that new learning more and more and more and more. So the more times, the more voluminous of times that you can do that, the stronger that information or those synapses become. Whereas the retrieval sort of theory, and I guess we're getting a bit tricky here, says that every Saturday you go for another surf, you're required to pull that information across and put it back into working memory or into short-term memory. Whereas in mass practice, you're not pulling it across that often because it never really gets to long-term memory in the first place. It's always sitting there in the short-term memory. Okay, so where's my eraser? Everything's on the floor today. So I just wanted to, where can I do this? I'll do it over here. I don't like rubbing stuff off the board. I like to keep it up there so you can take a screenshot or whatnot. But I have to. So I just want to write a couple of notes. About how this is relevant if you're actually working in a classroom, because you may be teaching surfing and kids do obviously outdoor ed and phys ed and all that kind of stuff, and they do learn these days a lot of, even this applies to cooking as well. So if you're in a home ec class, are they going to be learning something in a 2-week period? If they're doing it full time, will be a good foundation, but also maybe doing it once or twice a week over a period of year. There are reasons for why and interesting theories for why students are going to improve by doing things over a period of time. Now, there's one aspect of that is important. Review and consolidation. Now, the reason this is important and why I think that regardless of what class you're teaching, what colour we use? Black. Is because quite often what happens is this. Quite often what happens is that, let's say this is topic 1 and topic 2, topic 3, topic 4, and then let's say there is some type of exam or end there. So topic 1 goes for, say, 5 weeks, topic 2 goes for 5 weeks, topic 3 goes for 5 weeks, topic 4 goes for 5 weeks. Now, at the end of topic 1, what happens? Normally at the end of topic 1, that's it. You never hear about topic 1 again until students are tested on it at the very end here. Sometimes it builds on itself and things like that, depending on what type of program you're running. But generally students will study, or quite often, let's say you take a science class where students here are studying planets. So they may spend 5 weeks doing something on planets. So I'm just making this up, right? Once you've gone from planets, then in topic 2, we might do minerals. I'm not a science teacher, so I'm just making this up. You spend 4 or 5 weeks studying planets. That's your what teachers call a unit of work. Then they might spend 4 or 5 weeks studying minerals. And then from there, it might be physics. So then they'll spend 4 or 5 weeks studying physics. And what's another scientific one? What is another scientific one? Machines. Let's say machines. It's a horrible example, but you get my point, that we've got 4 completely separate scientific, let's call that AI. 4 completely separate topics in a science in, say, 2 terms, so 5, 10, 15, 20, so over 20 weeks, half a school year. Students study 4 different topics, roughly in that period of time. There's quite often an exam, or let's say some type of test or whatnot at this point here, at this point here, at this point here, and there's a big one at this point here. So that's the end of semester exam or something like that. Now, if there is a big exam here, which quite often in high schools there will be, in the middle of the year to sort of wrap up that term, what are the chances of students remembering any of that? Now, also, you can think of this not necessarily in a science way, but if students are doing maths or reading, or even if they do build on each other, so 1 builds on 2, 2 builds on 3 and 4 and so on and so forth, quite often the basics here just get forgotten. Now, what does spaced learning and what does, not so much encoding variability, but what does retrieval theory and consolidation theory tell us about this? Well, without spending more time on that, what it basically says is that our brains develop better over a period of time when we get those opportunities to practice and learn, as opposed to mass learning something at the start. So this is like a massed learning section, right? But what we want to do is provide opportunities for reviews and consolidation based on what we know about spaced learning. So we wouldn't just completely ignore this section on planets. What we would actually do is maybe at the end of this period here, have a review that covered both planets and minerals. And we might do the same one here, and we might do the same one there. Now that way, there is at least some type of spaced learning going on there. And every time you do a review, where's our retrieval? Every time you do a review, students have to retrieve that information from long-term memory, so it maintains those synapses and neurons and whatever, and doesn't let them shrink down to nothing, which we had a thing before that demonstrated that. And that way, and the other thing we could do here is we don't have to spend a huge amount of time doing it. We could actually just do that for 15 minutes. So it can be a little quiz or a little game or a little worked example. If you're doing in a 4-week period here, even if you spent 15 minutes of one lesson once every 2 weeks or something. So there might be a little bit here, 15 minutes here and 15 minutes here, which is 30 minutes in a 4-week period. And let's say you had, let's just do the maths on that. So you've got 4 hours per week times 4 weeks equals 16 hours. Of 16 hours, you were going to devote 5% to reviewing, 5% to reviewing and consolidating previous learning, so that by the time they get here, they've absolutely smashed that. They've aced that, right? Because they do a little bit of a review, and they're constantly getting better, constantly filling in gaps and skills in their knowledge. Now, this is just my little theory, by the way, of how to apply spaced learning in that sense when you're doing some type of program. If you're doing a reading program and students are at level 1 and level 2, and then you move them to level 3, it doesn't hurt to go back every now and then and to review those lower levels to make sure that they maintain all that knowledge and that ability that may, particularly of words and high utility words, that may not then pop up in the next level. So that constant referral and review back is really important. And we also do that not just over a period of time, but we also do that, I also like to do that, in a single lesson. So if we have a lesson like this, I always draw a lesson, let's draw a lesson plan. So we've got some type of lesson plan there. And this is one of the reasons, not so much, but this gives us an indication of one of the reasons for why reviews are important and why we always do them at the end, because it's the same effect, probably to a lesser extent, but the same effect. So you'll have a review here, let me use a different colour. You'll have a review here, and you'll have a review here. This is where you do your building on existing knowledge type stuff, or your linking. So you're linking this lesson to the previous lesson, right? So think of how that works in terms of these synapses and neurons, right? So students have this information in long-term memory, and these reviews are helping them retrieve that information from long-term memory to put it into their short-term memory so they can then work on it, so they can then send it back to long-term memory, hopefully with a few other bits and pieces of information as well. And then you're doing all this stuff in the middle, whatever you're going to do, right? Yada, yada, yada. And at the very end, you're going to do another review. So not only are you reviewing this information here, but you might incorporate that, and you might be looking at the information that came from previous sessions or previous weeks. So you're saying, well, how does that relate to that? How does that relate to that? And again, you're helping students with their short-term memory and taking that short-term memory and being able to apply it to their existing schema so that they can then sleep on it. These can develop and become even stronger, and there can be more shortcuts and things like that. And their existing connections in that schema, how the bits of information connect to each other, can be strengthened, I guess you could say, which means their understanding will improve. And of course, how does that apply? So how does that single lesson apply to these 3 or 4 different theories? Well, I've already explained just then how the synapses and neurons and things grow and develop and get stronger. And because you're doing it over a period of time, and under various different circumstances. So if you're doing, science, for example, here you're linking to the previous different sections that you've been studying. So if you were doing, I don't know, let's say we're doing minerals, and this lesson here was on minerals and it was on, I don't know, gold. This lesson was on silver and this lesson, whatever. So, but that way, you're taking the information that you know there and you're helping the student to see how it relates to the next aspect and to the previous aspects that they've studied over time. So that helps not only in the physical sort of aspect there, but in their general understanding and so on and so forth. So they're constantly sending that information backwards and forth. So they're forced to retrieve that information from long term to short term. So they're forced to retrieve what they know about silver as a mineral or metal or whatever it is, and to that therefore reinforces and ensures that those synapses and connections stay really strong. So that's what that retrieval theory is all about. Okay, that is space learning and mass practice and some, I guess you could say, some complicated sort of theories there that we probably don't need to spend too much time thinking about and memorising, especially if you're new to the education sector or you're just learning how these things apply. I wouldn't really be worrying about this for now, if that's you, if that fits your sort of situation, but certainly know that space learning and massed learning and deliberate practice, which was the one that I've actually since rubbed off, know how that basically works and what the differences are. There are some advantages of space learning, some advantages of mass practice. So there are pros and cons of both, and there are physical changes that happen in the brain, particularly as we go and sleep on things. Okay, so that's my take on space learning and mass practice in a very unscientific and probably technically not perfect sort of way. I hope that helps you, and good luck.